Hi, welcome to Conversations with me, Keren Ben-Horin, a fashion historian and curator. My guest today is Liz Way, an assistant curator at the museum at FIT in New York. We got to talk about one of my absolute favorite topics, hair. Liz told me about her research on African and African American hair, um, its social, cultural, even economic meaning in the 19th century and early 20th century. We also talked about her curatorial work, her research on Black fashion designers, as well as more recently on her exhibition, Fabric and Fashion, a fascinating look on the technology and trade of textile. Hi, Liz. How are you?
Hi, Karen. I'm well. How are you?
Great. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And so I'll just start by asking you to say who you are, introduce yourself, tell us what you do.
My name is Elizabeth Way, and I'm the Assistant Curator of Costume at the Museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology.
And and we'll talk about some of the work that you've done for the museum, but for our conversation I really wanted to start with a personal interest of mine, and it's a chapter that you wrote on hair. um, Here it is, and it's a book chapter from this publication, A Cultural History of Hair in the Age of Empire. And personally speaking, I have a very complex relationship with my own hair, and I'm sure a lot of people who have curly hair, um, different types of hair that do not align with um, straight, fashionable hair have this complex relationship. And so this is really like a personal thing for me, but your chapter really paints this complex picture of the meaning of hair, both as an oppression, a tool of oppression, but also a tool of empowerment. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about, first of all, how you even got interested in this. How did you come to write this chapter?
Well, first of all, I know exactly what you mean because for so much of the time we were growing up, like having stick straight hair was so important. And I have curly hair, you have beautiful curly hair. You always feel like you're out of control when you're trying to like control your hair. And so I'm sure a lot of women and men deal with that as well. So a lot of my personal research focuses on the intersection of African American culture with fashion. That's something I've been working on since I was getting my MA, and so I do a lot of research in this topic. And I met a fabulous scholar. She's actually a literature scholar in the UK named Sarah Heaton. We met at a couple of different conferences, and then she reached out to me because she, as the editor of this volume, was looking for someone to write about kind of race and ethnicity and hair. So she reached out. And so before that, I hadn't done very much research on hair. Although when you research African American fashion, hair comes up a lot. Of course, hair is an important part of women's fashion. It's always about the total look and the ensemble. So I'd come across some things. A lot of the texts that I've used over and over have talk about hair, but I hadn't done any writing on hair before this chapter.
So, one of and I should say that the chapter kind of moves along um, this story that starts with maybe the first thing relating to hair that enslaved people coming into the Americas experience, and that is the erasure of their culture and their affiliations through either shaving the hair or temming the hair in different ways. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so hair adornment, hair styling is very important in a myriad of African cultures. And in West and Central Africa, there are a lot of practices. It's a very communal practice about grooming hair, styling hair. People always had their hair styled in some way. And so often you could tell people's cultural affiliations, ethnic affiliations by their hairstyles. So one way that people who kidnapped slaves took them on the Middle Passage. One way to erase their kind of ethnic ties was to shave their heads. It was also very practical to kind of help with lice and other things, you know, because it was so unsanitary on the ships. But that was one way that, you know, coming to the New World, people really wanted to break the cultural bonds that Black Africans had because, you know, they feared rebellion, people coming together in those ways. And so they tried to separate people from different cultural groups. And then also, especially in the United States, in North America, really tried to stamp out practices of African culture. And of course, styling hair, especially Black hair, it requires a lot of tools. It requires a lot of knowledge, a lot of time, a lot of products, you know, natural products that they would have had. And enslaved people didn't have access to any of this. So they really had to improvise, find new sources of products for their hair, new tools that they could kind of co-opt into using to groom their hair.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about the image that we're seeing here?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting image. This is by Jean-Baptiste Debray, who came to Brazil in the early 19th century, and he did these kind of type drawings of enslaved women. And you can see here a myriad of different hairstyles. And what I love about this image, and these images you always have to read with a little bit of a grain of salt, because often, you know, they ask these enslaved people to sit for them, and so they might dress them up in a certain way. You know, it's, you know, the author, the illustrator always has a hand in kind of styling them. Mm-hmm. But what we do see is a lot of different hairstyles, some of them that use more kind of what we might think of West African styling practices. Some of them are European styling practices, and some of them are combinations of both. And you can see a lot of these women have scars on their faces, which is part of the culture of adornment from West Africa. And so from those marks, we can tell that they were people who were born in West Africa and brought to Brazil, as opposed to born in Brazil. Mm-hmm. So I really love this image because you just get this wide variety of different hairstyles. And styling your hair for women, for men, was a source of creativity, of you know, expressing their individuality, just as much as putting on clothing would have been. So you really see these beautiful, elaborate hairstyles, and you can just imagine the time that went into them.
Right, and interestingly, they're paired with what seems like European dress.
Yes.
Fashionable European dress of that time period.
So you see some of the women have like kind of plainer dresses. Some of them are more elaborate. So this would have been indicative of kind of the social status of these enslaved women, especially centered around what kind of work they did. So if they were working in domestic fields, if they were working in agricultural fields, if they were highly skilled, all of this affects kind of their social status, and their dress and hairstyles would have reflected that as well.
And another thing that is really interesting that comes up in the chapter is this idea that comes from eugenics that, you know, prevailed, especially during the 19th century, that ties the body, the hair to inferiority or supremacy. So how did that affect enslaved people and later in people, Black people in freedom?
Well, there was this whole pseudoscience, genre of pseudoscience that was all about eugenics and kind of measuring the body in different ways. And I came across texts from the 19th century where they would, you know, quote unquote scientists would put a strand of hair under a microscope, and they would write these long treatises about how, you know, white people, Caucasian people would have kind of a rounder cross section of their hair, and African people would have, you know, a different shape, and like Native American people would have different shapes, and how this all like kind of somehow made some sort of racial hierarchy. So they're taking all of these really details of the hair, also skin, you know, as more and more African American people kind of intermarried and, you know, were sexually assaulted by white people, you get a mixed culture. And so it became harder and harder for some people to differentiate between white people and Black people. And that was really important in maintaining a racial hierarchy. And so they're looking for all these genetic clues, trying to find science to differentiate Black people from white people and try and kind of create this hierarchy from that. And so hair was a really big part of that, really looking at kind of hair under a microscope and trying to tell the difference.
And also at the time period where already the culture is like obsessed with science, you have Darwin coming up with his like idea of evolution that kind of infiltrated the culture, also interpreted also in terms of racial evolution, quote unquote. So all of that really is in line or taps into exactly those things. And then there are people who are taking advantage of reclaiming or reappropriating those same ideas for racial uplift or empowerment.
And these are two images that I really loved from the chapter because they're just these really unexpected and kind of creative hairstyles. So the one on the left, this picture from the 1890s, this woman's hair is out. It's almost this, unstyled kind of hairstyle, and it's like for her wedding. So it's just it's really modern, and it's really innovative at that time, because in Africa, people would never walk around with their hair like this.
Mm-hmm.
There were kind of cultural taboos against not having your hair styled, like, that was a sign that you were, you had no family, you had no community, there was no one there to style your hair. So this idea of kind of almost like a precursor to the Afro, this is something that's really new and really American. And so I love this because it just seems so modern. And then the next photo on the right, this is just, these kind of elongated, like flattened curls. This is I've never seen a style like this. It almost looks like Marcel waves, but it's a little earlier. And so I just love all the creativity. Black hair is such a flexible medium. All hair really. You can do so many different things with your hair if you just have enough time to kind of style it, and the tools. And so these were just two really kind of unexpected and creative hairstyles.
And it's really kind of amazing the length that women, especially in the context of enslaved women, how much resources and time they devoted to styling their hair, sometimes under that were during the day or even during the whole week might be covered. And I think Stephanie Camp writes about it in her book, about sort of like, the length that they will go to even to straighten the hair underneath head covering. So it really is indicates that this was an important tool of self-expression.
Absolutely. And, for enslaved women who, like, during the week, they might be working in fields, they might be working in homes, doing really hard manual labor. If they got one day off a week on a Sunday, that was the one day to be a human being, to be a woman, to participate in fashion, to participate in their communities. And so it was worth it for them, for all week to have their hair in rollers under a kerchief working. And then on Sunday, they got to let it out and, just live like a regular person and kind of step away from their identity as just this anonymous slave.
And another really interesting aspect in your chapter is that hair and hair products later on, towards the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, also allowed Black people to participate in the economy.
Absolutely. Black women, we always hear about Madam C.J. Walker, but there are others, Annie Malone, who, they had their own hair problems, and they looked, they looked at natural ingredients, and they engaged in chemistry to create products that worked for them. And they knew that other women would be interested in them too. And so they were able to take this medium, just the way, we talk about fashion so much, just the way dressmakers were able to kind of use their skills, not only to make money, to buy property, but also employ other women and create businesses and, really become visible in society. And so hair and beauty, the beauty industry, was a really powerful tool for women at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century to, take their place in society.
And what were the kind of debates around Black hair during that time period?
Well, you have a lot of kind of within the Black community, and there's so many different Black communities, right? What's happening in New York isn't what's happening in LA or Chicago or Atlanta. That you have a lot of class politics, just like you have in all societies. And so there are, groups of African Americans, especially middle class, who really adhered to respectability politics. And they wanted to kind of adhere to mainstream style as much as possible, style their hair the way, the fashion plates did, and just kind of as closely cleave to those styles as possible. And there were other people, especially working class people, who rejected that. And, they wanted to express themselves however they wanted to, create their own hairstyles, wear the clothes that they wanted to wear. You know, most days of the week they had to wear a uniform if they were a maid or worked in a lot of different industries. And so on their time off, they wanted to express themselves the way they wanted to. And so you have a lot of discourse in fashion, in hair, within the Black community, because mainstream society tended to look at Black community as monolithic, as a, you know, all Black people were the same, when in fact you have a ton of different regional and class differences. And so the argument of the middle class is that everyone looks at us the same, so we should all kind of be the same in the most respectable way. But there were a lot of people who just didn't ascribe to those beliefs and didn't think they would work. And I think, you know, in the 21st century, we can say that they haven't worked.
Right. And what about writing this and researching this topic? How did that made you look about differently about what's happening today in fashion?
Well, because my time period was, you know, from 1800 to 1920, there were so many kind of really modern equivalents from like the 60s and the hair politics and the Black is Beautiful, and even more contemporary styles, you know, like hair shows. And like Black hair is it's such a specific kind of culture and world, and that the Black women, you know, the culture of the hair salon, the culture of the barbershop. So I didn't get into a ton of these things just because I didn't have the space in my chapter or necessarily the resources that talked about them, you know, in my time period. But it really made me appreciate how much is going on in hair right now and in the late 20th century. And it made me, you know, I hope someone's out there writing that too, because it's really interesting and important.
Really fascinating. And that kind of leads me to another really interesting project that you were involved with, co-curated the Black Fashion Designers exhibition with Ariel Alaya at the museum at FIT. And I want to quote something from you from the New York Times, because I think it's, I'm going to use your words against you.
Okay.
No, not against you, but I'm just kidding. But I think it's really, I think it really sums up really nicely, and it will, you know, I think it will be an interesting point to converse from. So you said the show is about Black makers, models, and designers, as opposed to Black style. It really isn't a Black style. And then you said you can say Black designers, but that doesn't give you any other information except how much they've been left out. So, you know, let's talk about that. How did the idea for the exhibition, where did it come from, and how it took shape, and how it shaped the kind of designers that were included in the kind of objects that were on display?
So the idea for the exhibition, and what you see on the screen here, this is actually a link to a mobile tour that is still active and live on FIT's website. So you can go there and get a lot of extra video and commentary that wasn't even in the exhibition. So that's still available. But the idea for the exhibition really originated with Ariel, my co-curator. And the two of us saw an exhibition at the Pratt Manhattan Galleries, which isn't too far from FIT. And it was it was called Black Dress, and it was curated by Adrienne Jones from Pratt. And it was 10 contemporary Black designers. And so it was a small but really lovely little exhibition. And one part of the exhibition was a huge kind of poster out at the very beginning with like probably 200 or more names of Black designers. And so Ariel was looking at this. We didn't go at the same time. And she was looking at this and she was thinking, how many of these designers are represented at the museum at FIT? And so she, you know, she started looking into this, and she started kind of researching our own collection. And that's where she got the idea to do the exhibition. And she asked me to co-curate it with her. And, you know, it really did take two of us to do it, because there were so many designers. You know, we would use, one of our greatest resources for the show was Women's Wear Daily and the archives, because so many working designers were kind of cataloged in that newspaper who there were no other sources for them. And so for us to divide the research into two and really dig into all of the designers, it took a lot of time and work. And I don't think one of us would have been able to do it on our own. But what we really came to understand is that, you know, Black designers, you know, just like we said in the New York Times, there's no one style. You know, it's Black designers, it's not hip hop style, it's not like Motown style, there's no Black style. And so we divided the show. Some of the parts of the show look at historical periods, especially in New York, but a lot of them look at different genres within design. So we have a menswear section and an evening wear section. We have a section that looks at different types of inspiration. For example, the way African cultures have influenced fashion designers, both in Africa and, you know, outside of Africa. But we really wanted to show a wide breadth of Black designer style, how they're designing, where they're designing. You know, we were able to look at pieces from Europe and Africa, as well as the United States. And we just really wanted to complicate this idea of Black style. And anyone who says they know what Black style is, like it's something made by Black makers. It's something worn by Black people. But other than that, you can't put a stylistic descriptor on it.
Right. And I feel like it's so telling of what's going on in the industry still today. And, you know, the underrepresentation that makes you ask questions about opportunities. Who gets the opportunities to be shown and where, and collecting, like our choices in collecting in museums. So I think, you know, this is such an important exhibition, and it seems to me that it's, you know, it was already a few years ago, and now you're getting this attention again. So, you know, in today's context, would you have done anything different? Do you think that there's, you know, do you read or think about this exhibition in a different way?
I mean, going back, once an exhibition closes, there's always you always want to add things or change things. I mean, the only thing I would have changed for this exhibition, I wish we could add more things, but we were honestly you know, our gallery was packed to the gills. I was really happy with how this exhibition turned out. We were very thoughtful. We were supported by an advisory committee. So we were really thoughtful about how we wanted to approach the subject, because we knew it would be controversial. And it's not to say that Ariel and I thought that every decision we made was the absolute best one, but we had a reason for doing everything that we did. So, you know, if anyone challenged us, we could say, well, this was our thought process behind that. So I'm really proud of this exhibition. You know, it's when it opened in 2016, people said like, oh, this is really prescient. Like, you know, did you do this because of the Black Lives Matter issues coming up now? We're like, no, we started planning this exhibition 2 years ago. Right. So the fact that it still feels very timely, that it still feels like very urgent, that's not that encouraging. So we hope that, you know, in 5 or 10 years, a show like this will not be seen as such a tapping into the culture in such a critical way, that hopefully some more diversity and some change has actually come to the fashion industry.
Right. And one of the themes in the exhibition was activism, that I want you to like talk a little bit about. You know, it sounds maybe like, what does fashion has to do with activism? But I think it's very actually linked, and I would love to hear you talk about it a little bit more.
That was my favorite part of the exhibition. We had designers, we had Patrick Kelly. A few of the pieces that we had one of his overalls dresses, and, you know, he was a designer from Mississippi. Even though he spent his entire career in Paris, he was always looking at the American South as inspiration. And so this overall dresses was something that he used to connect to his past and his family, who were sharecroppers in the South, agricultural workers. And so he was such a fun designer. The things he did were so charming and witty, but he really had these deep messages about Blackness and how Blackness is interpreted. And then kind of more contemporarily, we had Pierre Moss, and he had done a really evocative show around Black Lives Matter. He had these shirts, they have name shirts, that he produced for that show, for his staff for the show, you know, with the names of Black men who've been killed by the police. And then we also had a piece, an ensemble from his current collection. And then we also had a South African designer from a company called Stone Cherry that was looking at, they were really famous for these t-shirts that they made in Johannesburg that featured the cover of Drum magazine. And this magazine was something from the townships in Johannesburg when South Africa was divided by apartheid. So you have these designers who are really making important comments on what's happening in society. You know, being a Black designer is probably in and of itself a political statement, that you're out there, you're visible, you're making fashion, you're contributing to fashion culture. But there's some designers who really kind of take a step deeper and really explore those issues through their fashion.
I do want to spend a minute talking about Aunt Lo, because that's a really, really interesting story. And I think she's a really early example of someone who did not go down in the history books. Well, she should have. So can you share a little bit about her story?
Yeah, so Anne Lowe was a dressmaker, and she was probably most kind of famous for the people who know her for designing Jackie Kennedy's wedding dress in 1953. And at that point, in the mid 50s up into the mid 60s, this was the high point of her career. But she'd been working as a dressmaker since she was a child. Her mother and grandmother had both been enslaved. They lived in Alabama, and they had they were dressmakers as enslaved laborers. And then when they were freed, they took that enslaved labor and transformed it into free labor. And they passed that down, from her grandmother to her mother to Anne Lowe. Anne Lowe's mother died unexpectedly when she was 16, and she took over her mother's business. They were known for making ball gowns for, the socialites of Alabama in Montgomery. Like the governor's wife was one of the dresses that she made after her mother died. And then, she got married, she had a son in Alabama, and she left her husband and moved to Florida when she was offered a job. Her husband didn't really want her to work, and she loved making dresses. So she took her son and she left. And the idea that a Black woman was doing that, in the 19 teens, that's pretty revolutionary. Mm-hmm. She worked in Tampa, Florida for a long time, and then she moved to New York. She actually moved to New York right before the Great Depression. So she really struggled in establishing her business, but she always catered to kind of elite white society. And this is, she was really known for debutante gowns and ball gowns and wedding gowns. And so that was really her niche. And she had this really exquisite eye to make these really beautiful feminine dresses, and also really beautiful hand skill. So she made these really intricate fabric flowers, and you can see the embroidery on this wedding dress on the left. She was really known for these really delicate details. She was referred to as like society's best kept secret, because she made gowns, not just for Jackie Kennedy was a Bouvier, her mother was an Auchincloss, but also the Roosevelts, the DuPonts, these names that kind of go down in history for being very wealthy. These were her clientele. So
was it for a Black woman to cater to white clients?
It was really, really rare. So I've done some studies that look at dressmakers in New York specifically, and the percentage of dressmakers Black dressmakers compared to white dressmakers is very, very small. And what that tells us is that Black dressmakers most likely catered to a Black clientele. There were enough white dressmakers, not to mention, the couturiers in Paris that very rich women could go to, that there were a lot of choices. So for especially an elite white woman to go to a Black dressmaker, there had to be really something special about them. And it's not unheard of. Elizabeth Keckley was a dressmaker in the 1860s in Washington, D.C., who sewed for Mary Todd Lincoln. There was a woman named Fanny Criss in Richmond in the 1910s who sewed for white society, but these were really rare examples.
And at the time when she made Jackie Kennedy's dress, was there press about it? Like how well covered was it by the media?
It wasn't really well covered at all. She wasn't Christian Dior. She didn't have that kind of name recognition, and it wasn't necessarily kind of the practice as it is, on a red carpet today to say, who are you wearing? Like, who made your dress? Yeah. And, she was Jackie Kennedy's mother's dressmaker. And so she made Jackie and Lee's debutante gowns, but it really represented, I think, my own personal theory for Jackie Kennedy, something that had to do with her childhood and her teenage years, because you can see, if you see pictures of Jackie Kennedy's dress, it's this very over-the-top feminine 1950s style, and that's not really what we associate with her style later going forward. There are rumors that she didn't even really like her dress, but it was definitely her mother's choice, her mother kind of making those decisions. But Anne Lowe did not get a ton of press. I mean, she was covered by the press in her lifetime, the Saturday Evening Post, Ebony Magazine, and she was quoted in the New York Times several times thinking about debutante gowns. People would ask her, what's the new trend in debutante gowns this year? Because she was so well known for that. But she wasn't definitely a kind of nationally recognized figure, like we would say, like, a big designer like Christian Dior would have been.
So from that, I want to make like a big leap, but I think at the end it will kind of come full circle. And that is another exhibition that you curated, Fabric in Fashion. This is one of my personal favorites, not only because I think fabric and textile don't always get the attention in the context of fashion exhibitions, But also I think it's just an amazing resource for students, and I've taught textile history. And so first of all, where did this idea come from? Why fabric in fashion?
Well, I was looking to do a show. This is actually the first show that I curated on my own, not co-curated. And I was pitching all of these ideas to our director. And, you know, she's telling me, like, these ideas are too complicated. Like, these are, you should write a paper about this. This isn't a great exhibition. Exhibitions need to be straightforward. They need to speak to an audience. And so she recommended to me, she's like, just go into the collection, look around the collection, be with the objects, and see what it says to you. And that's where the idea for this exhibition really came from, just walking up and down our collection and looking at the beautiful fabrics. We have some exquisite pieces, but this show was really informed by my background. You know, I studied fashion design in my undergrad. I studied pattern making. I worked briefly as a pattern maker in the fashion industry in New York. And, you know, I can sew, I can make a few things. And so I had a familiarity with working with textiles, working with fabric and putting things together. And so I think that that really gave me a unique perspective. And so I'm not surprised that you like this, because I know you have experience in the industry as well.
Right.
That I think, you know, when you sew or when you make clothes, you do pay a little bit more attention to kind of the nuts and bolts, the fabric, the stitching, those things that someone who's looking at it more aesthetically might see just kind of an overall picture.
And I think also with sort of like the global, I don't like to use that word, but with the outsourcing, I would actually say, of clothes making, of all of those, and even textile making, when we outsource all of that, and then it becomes so far removed from the designers. From my experience with the students, you know, they come and they don't even understand basic things like the difference between a woven and a knitted fabric. So I think having, like, you know, putting textiles on a platform like that in the museum is so important, and pointing out not just the different structures and the different fibers like you do have in the exhibition, but also their kind of broader meaning for industry, for society.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would love to hear you talk a little bit about sort of like the organization of the show, but also those little things like, you know, where fabrics came from, and how they were appropriated.
So I divided the exhibition up. The first two sections I really wanted to be about looking at the objects. And so the first one was about fibers. And I took 4 dresses that kind of had a similar look. The fabrics had a similar look, but they were made from 4 different fibers. So like cotton, silk, wool, and synthetics, which I looked at later in the show. And then the second platform was about the weave of textiles, and looking at how when you change the scale of the yarn or the weave, you get a totally different effect. So I really wanted people to look at, like, all of the dresses in that section were silk, so the same fiber, but when you weave in a different way, you get a stiff fabric or a really drapey fabric, or and just changing that scale changes the look of the fabric 100%, and that changes the look of a dress 100%. So when designers choose this fabric, they have an idea in their head about what it can do, the mechanics of it, and it's not just a random choice. Mm-hmm. And then I looked at these 4 fibers: silk, wool, synthetics, and cotton. And they really have this huge economic history. You know, the silk, we tie back to the Silk Road. I mean, the pursuit of silk as a luxury fiber fueled exploration and cultural exchange. Going back thousands and thousands of years. Mm-hmm. And one of the major points I really wanted to make with that section was that before the 19th century, Asia was where all luxury came from. Mm-hmm. Everything nice, food, silk, textiles, all of that came from Asia.
Spices.
Absolutely. And so today we have this kind of converse attitude about things that are made, especially in China. But China has a long, long history of making things that go around the world. And for most of that history, it has been extreme luxury. Cotton also has, like, you know, a huge effect on the world economy. You know, cotton really drove, along with some other things like sugar, really drove enslavement.
Exactly.
especially in the United States. And at one point, it was the biggest industry in the United States, not just in the South where they were growing cotton, but in a city like New York where they were financing not only enslavement, but selling the cotton to the UK and then the Industrial Revolution. So there's so many historic, economic, political factors that go into this textile that all of us wear every day. And then I talked a little bit more about the consumer revolution. You can see this dress on the left. When we start to get more mechanized weaving, spinning, things like that, we can get these really, really elaborate textiles. So if you look at the tiers of this dress, you see all these different colors and textures. This is actually one length of fabric. And they change, the weave changes from an ottoman to this velvet to these big loops that you kind of see. It's really an extraordinary dress. So we had another section in the show that looked at wool, and you can see this ensemble on the right side. This is from a design studio called Bodice in India. And the designer, she uses only reclaimed textiles. It's all about sustainability. It's all produced locally. And so you have this very, very modern kind of ensemble, this bomber jacket and these joggers. She won the International Woolmark Prize. And so this is all for designs in wool. And it's, you know, an example of this kind of worldwide industrial conglomerate like the Woolmark really engaging with fashion. We sometimes don't associate textiles and fibers with fashion, which is a little counterintuitive. So I really liked this example as something contemporary that brought, you know, the industry to kind of the design.
Right, and I think as designers, and I'm sure you know that from your experience, almost always the collection starts from the textiles. It's really one of the first things that we do as designers. We source the textiles,
Yeah.
And develop our designs from there. So I think it was so appropriate to have it in, like, you know, in a fashion museum, to have you know, to have a show that focuses on fabrics in this way. And, you know, to kind of go back to your point about enslavement, also to your point about China and India. And, you know, I think India in particular is a really interesting story, both socially and economically, of a country that was an empire of cotton production, of printing, where printing techniques originated from that almost no one knew how to imitate. And then, you know, the British come along and they essentially destroy the local economy.
Yeah. I found that was really fascinating because we think about fabrics like chintz or calicos that seem kind of quintessentially English. These are all, even Madras plaids, these are all Indian fabrics. And, you know, in the 1600s, 1700s, Europeans didn't know how to make those cotton prints color fast. That was a technology, a chemistry that Indian printers knew. So the Europeans were very, very interested in this because cotton is a much more durable and comfortable fabric than wool, and you know, it's cheaper than silk, and so it was very in demand. But once, you know, the British kind of got their foot in, you know, sourcing cotton was a major part of colonization, and then they made it illegal for Indians to grow their own cotton, weave their own textiles. They wanted the raw cotton, and then they wanted to produce it in England and export it again, and so they really decimated millions of people's livelihood. That's why, you know, we see these pictures of Mahatma Gandhi in these homespun cotton fabrics. He wanted Indian people to weave their own fabric, spin their own cotton, to boycott British goods. Cotton was a huge part of the colonization of India. And, you know, even when you go there today, they have been able to revive some of those skills, and you see some of those textiles in, you know, European, American fashion, but just the skill level and the beauty of their textiles is really breathtaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And also to add into your point about the British, also, you know, they had new machineries that enabled them to print more quickly, to weave more quickly, also adding to even further reducing Indian textiles, even to the wider world, which they, you know, really controlled a lot of the trade of cotton into America as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so really such a such a great exhibition. And I want to kind of wrap it up by maybe explain a little bit about what we're seeing here, because this was such a great part of the exhibition.
So this was really exciting for me. I got this idea. We have what you see in the top left hand corner. This is a toile we have of an 18th century court gown. We hold the original court gown in our collection, and at some point in the past, someone at FIT made this cotton toile that resides in our study collection. So students can look at it, you know, they can see the form and how it's put together. And what I wanted to do was project different textiles onto it, because I really wanted to make this point that, especially at that time in France, the silhouette didn't change that much for a court gown. It was the different textiles, the different fabrics, the different colors that determined whether you're in fashion or not. So I wanted to have all these different textiles, and you can see different examples. For example, this purple and green striped fabric, this is a fabric from Nigeria, a cotton. And then you have the madras from India in the middle, and then you on the right, you have this really beautiful hand-painted silk from China. So I wanted to have all these different historical textiles from all over the world projected onto this one dress. You know, we think of like 18th century France as this epitome of fashion and kind of European culture, but I really wanted to show how global the textile industry was. And so we worked with, I worked with my digital media manager at the museum, Tamsin Young, who was amazing. She found this software to kind of, you can see in the middle here, the software that she used to create this. She actually won an award for this display that she created, but she did an amazing job kind of mapping the projection so that it would only be on the dress sheet. She had a lot of technical insight into this, but it turned out to be really beautiful and really eye-catching when people walked into the show.
Absolutely. Well, Liz, thank you so much. You know, this has been so interesting, and your work is so profoundly, you know, meaningful and important, and so like well researched, and really, I think, adding very important conversations to fashion history, and that are really relevant for today. So thank you again. You know,
of course, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to be here and to talk to you, to catch up with you.
Thank you.